The first time my husband's secretary called him my man in front of me. She did it with one hand on his thermos and the other resting on his office door like she owned both. That was the moment the whole floor went quiet. Not because anyone was shocked by an office flirtation. Corporate buildings are full of those. No. The silence came because of where she said it, how she said it, and who she thought I was when she said it. I was standing 3 feet away in a navy coat, holding the leather portfolio Dean had left on our kitchen island that morning. He'd rushed out before sunrise, muttering about a board prep call and some revised acquisition notes he absolutely needed before 10. He hadn't kissed me goodbye. He hadn't even looked at me long enough to register whether I was still in the doorway. Lately, that had become a habit with him, a small cruelty, repeated often enough to make neglect feel like normal weather. So I drove the portfolio downtown myself. Carrington Biotech occupied 27 floors of cold glass and brushed steel in Midtown. The kind of building designed to make every visitor feel like they should apologize for breathing too loudly in the lobby. I had been there before. Of course. But not often. That was how Dean preferred it. He liked keeping categories separate. Investors in one box, staff in another, home in another. Me, especially me, somewhere tasteful and largely invisible, unless a gala required a wife. The receptionist on the executive floor had looked at my coat, then my portfolio, then my face, and asked if I was with catering or legal delivery. That should have told me enough. I smiled, said I was there to see Dean Carrington, and watched her type something into the internal message system without asking my last name. 2 minutes later, Camille Hart came striding down the corridor in ivory heels, and confidence so polished it almost counted as aggression. She was younger than I expected. Maybe 28. Beautiful in the kind of expensive, sharpened way that suggests a life built from mirrors, ambition, and men who enjoy being admired in the right lighting. Her hair was pulled back into a smooth twist. Her blouse looked like liquid silk. Her lipstick was exact. She moved with the proprietary speed of a woman who had mistaken access for rank and repetition for entitlement. She didn't ask who I was. That was her first mistake. She looked at the portfolio in my hands and said, "You can give that to me." Not hello. Not thank you. Just a command. The way one speaks to people already placed beneath them. I didn't hand it over. "I'll give it to Dean," I said. That was when she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind some women use when they think the person in front of them has misunderstood the local hierarchy and is about to be corrected by someone who enjoys doing it. "Oh, honey," she said, resting one manicured hand on the stainless steel thermos balanced against her hip. "Dean doesn't have time for random drop-ins." Honey. Random drop-ins. I looked past her. Down the hall toward the glass-walled corner office, with Dean's name etched discreetly on the frosted panel. His door was cracked open. I could see the line of his suit jacket hanging over the back of his chair. He was inside. She saw my eyes go there and shifted. Just slightly. To block my view. Then she lifted the thermos a little and laughed. My man barely even drinks coffee unless I make it right. There it was. Not subtle. Not deniable. Not flirtation floating safely above the surface where everybody could pretend not to see it. Possession. And then, because humiliation like that is rarely satisfied with one strike, she tilted her head at me and added, "So, unless you're on his calendar, you should probably leave it with me." The entire executive corridor went still. An associate coming out of compliance stopped mid-step and looked down at his phone too fast. A paralegal near the copy room suddenly found the floor fascinating. Even the receptionist stopped typing. Everyone on that floor knew exactly what Camille Hart had just implied. And everyone assumed I did too. What they didn't know was that I had been married to Dean Carrington for 4 years. 11 months. And 6 days. They didn't know because Dean never wore his ring to work anymore. They didn't know because the framed photo that used to sit on his credenza had disappeared sometime in March. They didn't know because his secretary had apparently become so comfortable inhabiting my absence that she no longer bothered to imagine I might step into it. I should tell you that I felt rage first. I didn't. I felt recognition. The clean, cold kind. The kind that arrives when something you've been trying not to name finally walks up, looks you in the face, and calls your husband, my man, in a hallway full of witnesses. I looked at Camille, then at the thermos in her hand, then at Dean's office door. And I realized something almost peaceful. If she was bold enough to say it in front of me, then Dean had already made me disappear here long before I walked in. That was the part that hurt. Not the secretary. Not even the arrogance. The vacancy he had cleared for her. Camille held out her hand again, still smiling that small, condescending smile. The portfolio? I met her eyes and asked the only question that mattered. And who? I said, very calmly. Do you think I am? For the first time. Her smile slipped. Just a little. But enough. Because somewhere behind that office door, my husband was still sitting at his desk, unaware that in the next 10 seconds, the whole architecture of his careful little corporate fantasy was about to crack right down the center. The truth is, Camille Hart didn't invent the vacancy. Dean did. That was the thing I understood standing in that executive corridor, while his secretary smiled at me like I was some overdressed courier who had mistaken confidence for clearance. Women like Camille are never the origin of a betrayal. They are the weather pattern that moves into an atmosphere someone else has already made possible. And Dean had made it possible for a long time. The first year we were married, he still introduced me correctly. Not constantly, not with pride so much as careful usefulness. This is my wife, Nora, he'd say at donor dinners, investor brunches, foundation galas. If people knew my family name Ellison, it was because they already moved in the sort of rooms where old money circulated quietly through boards and hospitals and private scholarships. If they didn't know it, Dean didn't volunteer much. That never bothered me at first. I had grown up around enough family capital to find public naming vaguely tacky. My father used to say that truly expensive people didn't need to decorate sentences with what they owned. Dean, however, was not my father. He came from the tier just below permanence. Good schools, good suits, good instincts. The kind of family that never worried about groceries but still treated invitations like currency. He was handsome in the tidy, strategic way corporate America rewards in men broad-shouldered. Dark-haired, controlled, just warm enough to be called charismatic by people who mistake ambition for gravity. What first attracted me to him was not his confidence. It was his hunger. At 29, standing in a room full of men who had inherited certainty, Dean still looked as if he intended to earn his place. I admired that. Or maybe I mistook appetite for seriousness. It happens more often than women like to admit. By year 2, he had already started changing. Not crudely. Men like Dean never change in ways that are easy to point at. They refine themselves around new access. He learned which parts of my life mattered more than he first understood. Which friends were worth remembering. Which boards my father had once chaired. Which old banking families still took my mother's calls before they took anybody else's. Which introductions carried weight beyond the room they happened in. And because I loved him, or thought I did, I helped. That's the humiliating part people usually leave out of stories like this. The woman doesn't simply get betrayed. Often she participates out of loyalty, optimism, generosity, or simple marital stupidity in building the platform from which the betrayal later speaks. I helped Dean with donor mapping when his development team couldn't get traction in Northeast pharma circles. I prepped him for 2 foundation dinners, where he needed to sound less like a man selling biotech optimism and more like someone who understood patient outcomes and quiet stewardship. I introduced him to Victor Hale, one of my late father's oldest friends, who later joined Carrington Biotech's advisory board because he believed Dean was ambitious, but still moldable. That line stays with me now. still moldable. As if there had once been a version of him capable of becoming decent if the right people invested enough patience. By year 3, Dean had learned something dangerous. The right kind of wife can function like invisible infrastructure. She makes the room easier for him. Softer. More credible. Better financed. More connected. She smooths social edges. Steadies egos. Improves the caliber of the people who return his calls. And if she comes from money but doesn't flaunt it, all the better. Men like Dean love power best when it arrives under cover of elegance and can still be spoken about as if they made it all themselves. That was when the introductions changed. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. He stopped saying my wife. Nora and started saying Nora in rooms where a husband should have used more clarity. Then, later, just my wife in rooms where my own name might have been useful independently. Then, eventually, there were events where I discovered after the fact that he'd gone alone. Telling people I wasn't really into the corporate side of things. I was. I just wasn't into his version of it. And in offices, the change was even sharper. Carrington Biotech became his kingdom in the way mediocre men often treat spaces where they have title but not necessarily depth. He loved the corner office, the etched glass, the executive floor, the assistants moving around him like his thoughts had mass. He loved being the man people waited outside for. Loved looking busy. Loved saying circle back and move it offline and let's take the temperature of the room as if language itself could create substance. Somewhere during that stretch, he stopped wearing his wedding ring to work. He said it was because it snagged on folders and phone chargers. I believed him because I wanted the marriage to stay smaller than the evidence. Then the photo disappeared from his desk. Then the receptionist stopped recognizing my name. Then a legal draft came to the house addressed only to him. Though the underlying asset structure affected both of us, I noticed every one of these things. Quietly. The way women notice the slow theft of their place long before they know whether it's wise to name it. And still, because I had been raised by people who thought discretion was a form of dignity, I kept not making scenes. That was what Dean counted on. By the time Camille arrived, the vacancy had already been prepared. She was not the cause of the insult in that hallway. She was the proof of how thoroughly he had redrawn the map. Secretaries do not usually call chief executives "my man" in front of random visitors unless they have been made to believe the territory is unoccupied. That was why what she said hurt in such a clean, terrible way. Not because she was bold. Because she was comfortable. Comfort never comes from one flirtation. It comes from repeated permission. So when I stood there with Dean's portfolio in my hand and Camille smiling at me like I was beneath the level of explanation, I didn't just see a secretary overstepping. I saw years of quiet erasure reaching their natural conclusion. She only said it out loud because Dean had already made sure nobody there would think to question her. Camille should have stepped back when I asked who she thought I was. A smart woman would have. A careful woman would have laughed lightly, pretended she misunderstood, and gone to fetch Dean before the corridor had time to become a memory anyone else might later enjoy repeating. But Camille was not smart in the way that protects you. She was smart in the way that gets rewarded for a few years in the wrong kind of office, polished, fast, socially ruthless, and so accustomed to borrowed power that she had forgotten the difference between proximity and ownership. So instead of retreating, she doubled down. She gave me that small, indulgent smile women use when they believe the other woman is about to discover the pecking order the hard way. "You're clearly not his wife," she said. That was the line. Not "who are you?" Not "what is your name?" Not even "do you have an appointment?" She chose certainty. She chose to say it in front of the receptionist, the compliance associate by the copy room, the paralegal frozen by the corner printer, and whoever else had suddenly decided that the corridor outside Dean Carrington's office was more interesting than whatever spreadsheet they had been pretending to care about 30 seconds earlier. And then, because humiliation like that rarely stops at one clean blow, she laughed and added, "Trust me. I'd know." The entire floor changed temperature. That was not flirtation anymore. Not workplace gossip. Not a secretary overstepping into personal ambiguity. That was public claim. Public possession. Public dismissal. And behind the cracked office door, Dean still hadn't come out. That was the thing that almost hurt most. Not that Camille was bold enough to say it, that she was bold enough to say it with confidence. Confidence like that doesn't come from hope. It comes from repetition. From being allowed to speak too familiarly. Stand too closely. Carry too much of a man's domestic rhythm into his professional life. The thermos in her hand. The use of my man. The way she blocked his office door with her body, as if access to him ran through her first. None of that had been improvised. It had been learned. I looked at her. Then, at the etched name on the frosted panel. Then, at the empty ring on Dean's left hand when he finally appeared in the doorway. He wasn't supposed to hear the whole thing. You could tell from the look on his face. He had the expression of a man walking into a room he assumed he controlled only to find the wrong people already speaking in it. For one beat, his eyes went to me. Then, to Camille. Then, to the portfolio in my hands. And finally to my face again. Nora, he said. Just my name. No warmth. No alarm. Not even enough surprise to satisfy me. Camille turned so fast the thermos almost slipped from her hand. Dean. I was just handling. He cut his eyes toward her. But not sharply enough. That was what told me he was still calculating. Not horrified. A good husband would have understood instantly what the situation required. A decent one would at least have recognized that something unforgivable had already been said. Dean's first instinct, instead, was management. What are you doing here? He asked me. There it was. Not are you okay? Not what did she just say? Not Camille. Step away from my wife. Just, what are you doing here? As if I were the intrusion. As if his secretary publicly claiming him in front of me was a scheduling inconvenience, and the real disorder was that I had brought it into daylight. I lifted the portfolio slightly. You left this at home. He stared at it for 1 second too long. Then, back at me. Then at the cluster of employees who were now pretending. Very badly. Not to be witnessing the collapse of his careful little arrangement. Camille still did not understand the danger. Or maybe she did. But arrogance had outrun her exit. She placed one hand lightly on the office doorframe and said, in a tone so smooth, it made my skin go cold. I told her Dean was busy. Dean. Not Mr. Carrington. Not even Sir. Dean. In front of me? In front of the floor. And what did my husband do? Nothing. That was the humiliation. Not the secretary. Not really. Secretaries don't create vacancies that profound by themselves. They occupy them. Dean had built this whole little climate for her, one in which my existence was so absent that she felt safe saying, trust me. I'd know while looking me in the eye. The compliance associate suddenly turned and disappeared into the copy room. Which told me 2 things. First, she had heard enough to know it was dangerous. Second, everyone on this floor would know by lunch, no matter how hard management tried to contain it. I handed Dean the portfolio. He took it. Finally. But his fingers brushed the leather without conviction. As if the object itself were less important now than surviving the room. Nora, he said again. Quieter this time. Can we do this later? Can we do this later? I almost laughed, because there it was, the same cowardly instinct all men like him have. Public disrespect when it serves them. Private repair only when the public moment turns against them. Camille looked from him to me. And for the first time, real uncertainty entered her face. She was beginning to understand. Not fully, but enough. Enough to see that Dean was not introducing me. Enough to feel that the silence around us had become hostile in a direction she had not intended. I looked at her. Then at him. Then I asked the question that pushed the whole thing past the point of polite recovery. Do they all know? I said. Dean's jaw tightened. I didn't need him to answer. The answer was everywhere. In the receptionist who hadn't asked my last name. In the missing photo. In the absent ring. In Camille's certainty. In the way the executive floor watched me now, not as the wife. Not even as the scandal. But as the woman who had just discovered how thoroughly she'd been erased here. Dean lowered his voice. Not here. No. That word went through me like glass. I took one step back. Not away from him. But away from the fiction that this was still salvageable through tone. And then Camille. God help her. Made the final mistake. She looked straight at me and said, If you're here to make a scene, take it downstairs. Downstairs? As if I were the embarrassment. As if she were the one withstanding here. As if the wife belonged in the lobby and the secretary at the door. That was the moment the insult passed beyond personal betrayal and into something cleaner. Something I could use. I turned my head slightly toward the receptionist's desk and said, in a voice calm enough to cut, Would you please call Victor Hale and tell him I'm on the executive floor? Dean's face changed instantly. Camille's didn't yet. Because she still didn't know who Victor Hale was. But Dean did, and for the first time since I stepped off the elevator. My husband looked afraid. I didn't raise my voice. That was the first thing that threw both of them off. If I had snapped at Camille, she would have known how to respond. Women like her are trained for emotional conflict. She could have widened her eyes. Gone, trembly, and innocent. And let the floor decide I was unstable. If I had turned on Dean, he would have slipped into that low, managerial tone men use when they want to make their wives sound unreasonable in front of colleagues. He would have touched my elbow, guided me toward a conference room, and later explained to everyone that there had been a misunderstanding at home. I gave them neither of those exits. When I asked the receptionist to call Victor Hale, I did it the same way I might have asked for water. Calmly, precisely. No trema, no spectacle, no mercy. The receptionist froze with one hand still above her keyboard. She was maybe 23. Sharp enough to know that something irreversible was happening, and young enough not to hide it well. Her eyes flicked to Dean so fast it almost looked painful. Dean answered first. No, he said. Not loudly. Worse than that. Quickly. Reflexively. The way people answer when they are not trying to manage a misunderstanding but stop a chain reaction. He stepped out of his office fully now, closing the distance between us with that careful executive stride he used in boardrooms when pretending calm was half the work. There's no need to involve Victor. There it was. Not who told you Victor was involved. Not why would you call him. Not this isn't his concern. Just, there's no need to involve Victor. Meaning he knew exactly why the name mattered. Camille, however, still looked confused. She was glancing between us with that brittle little half-smile women wear when they're trying to decide whether this is still a game they can win by staying arrogant. Who's Victor? She asked. That sentence nearly finished her. Not because of the words themselves. Because of the silence they created after. The compliance associate came back out of the copy room at the exact wrong moment and heard all of it. The receptionist looked like she wanted to melt into the desk. Even Dean closed his eyes for half a beat. Which told me everything I needed to know about how badly his office fantasy had already outgrown its containment plan. Victor Hale was not just a board member. He was Carrington Biotech's lead outside counsel. One of my late father's oldest friends. And the man who had structured the private capital bridge that kept Dean's last acquisition from blowing a hole through his balance sheet 2 years ago. He was also the person who made Dean's rise survivable once the cash got more complicated than the ambition. In other words, if Victor Hale came upstairs, the lie would not remain social for another second. It would become procedural. And Dean was terrified of that. I looked at Camille then. And for the first time, I let her see exactly how little I thought of her certainty. You should have known that name, I said. Her chin lifted. Defensive now. I don't need to know every donor your husband. Stop. Dean snapped. That one word cracked the whole corridor open. He hadn't spoken sharply to her before. Not once. Not while she called him my man. Not while she told me she'd know if I were his wife. Not while she suggested I take the scene downstairs like I was some embarrassing delivery from home. But the second legal reality entered the space. That was when he found urgency. Interesting. Camille heard it too. Her face changed. Not much. Just enough. That was the moment she realized two things at once. First, she had not been nearly as informed as she thought. Second, Dean had let her walk into that ignorance anyway. I should tell you I enjoyed that. I did. Not because I suddenly liked her suffering. Because arrogance without information is one of the ugliest social instincts in the world. And watching it meet consequence is clarifying. The receptionist still hadn't moved. I turned back to her. Please make the call. Dean stepped closer. Nora. Just my name again. Still no wife. Still no public correction. Still no instinct to restore what had just been damaged in front of his own staff. That was when I knew, with a coldness that almost felt like relief, that whatever happened next would not be me saving a marriage. It would be me exiting a lie. Dean lowered his voice. You're overreacting. There it was. The oldest refuge. A woman publicly humiliated is always overreacting the moment she stops cooperating with the humiliation. I smiled a little. Not pleasantly. Your secretary called you her man in front of me, I said. Then told me I was obviously not your wife, and your first instinct was to stop a phone call instead of correcting her. The receptionist looked down. The compliance associate looked away. Camille stayed very still, because once words like that are spoken clearly in an office, everyone stops pretending they might have misunderstood the structure of the insult. Dean rubbed one hand over his mouth. This isn't the place. No. That line should be engraved over the doors of every executive floor in America. Men use workplaces to build the lie, and then act offended when truth arrives there too. I took a step back from him. Not retreat. Space. The kind you create when you want the room to understand you are done being handled. Actually, I said, this is exactly the place. Then I placed my wedding ring on top of the leather portfolio he was still holding. Not dramatically. Just slid it off and set it there between us. In full view of the receptionist, the compliance associate, the paralegal now standing motionless near the copy room, and Camel Hart, who had finally started to look less like a conqueror and more like a woman, realizing she had been standing in someone else's marriage, wearing borrowed certainty. Dean stared at the ring. That got him more than anything else had. Nora, he said again. But there was fear in it now. Good, because I was done offering him calm without consequence. I turned to the receptionist one last time. Please call Mr. Y. Hale, I said, and let him know Dean's wife is on the executive floor. This time, she moved. And Dean? For the first time since I arrived. I didn't try to stop her. The first layer of truth was Victor Hale. Not because he was dramatic. Quite the opposite. If Dean had been afraid of my mother, he might still have tried to manage the room with emotion. Simone Vale was social force. Old board elegance. The sort of woman who could freeze donors with a look and still send flowers the next day. Dean knew how to flatter women like that. Knew how to survive around them by looking attentive and grateful. Victor was different. Victor Hale was legal memory in a navy suit. He had known my father before Dean had learned how to knot a decent tie. And he had the sort of calm that made weak men volunteer information just to break the silence around themselves. He was also the architect behind two of Carrington Biotech's most important financing structures. Which meant Dean's confidence had always rested. At least in part. On Victor's continuing willingness to believe he was worth protecting. That was why Dean went pale when I said his name. And that was why the receptionist's hand shook when she finally lifted the phone. Camille still didn't understand. Not fully. She was beginning to sense danger. Yes. But in the shallow way, people sense storms when they hear windows rattle without understanding the roofline. Her confidence had fractured, but not yet reorganized. She looked at Dean, then at my ring sitting on the portfolio, then at me. And I could see the questions ricocheting behind her eyes. If I'm his wife? Then why didn't I know? If I didn't know, what have I been saying? If I've been saying it publicly, what has he been letting me believe? Good. Let her feel all of that. The receptionist murmured into the phone, listened, then glanced up at me with startled eyes. He's already on his way up, she said. Of course he was. That was layer 1 of truth. Not just that Victor Hale knew me, that he came when I asked. Dean heard it too. He closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them, already trying to calculate a new script. Nora, he said quietly, come into my office. No. That line was dead now. I looked at the office behind him, glass walls, polished credenza. The city reflected in the windows. The little ecosystem of power he had built by making me increasingly abstract inside it. Somewhere in there had once been a framed photo of us from our 2nd anniversary. Somewhere in there he had decided to remove it. Somewhere in there he had stopped being a husband during daylight hours because the optics of availability mattered more to him than the truth of marriage. I'm fine here, I said. Camille swallowed. Dean. I didn't know, he snapped before he could stop himself. Stop talking. That was revealing too. Not because it was cruel, because he still aimed his urgency at the wrong person. Not at the insult. Not at the correction. Not at me. At the witness he could still potentially control. Camille recoiled, not much, but enough. Her hand tightened around the thermos. That detail almost made me laugh. The little domestic prop she'd used to mark territory now looked ridiculous in her grip, like a costume piece that had survived into the wrong act. Then Victor arrived. He came off the elevator with no visible haste, which made the whole thing worse for Dean. Fast entrances can be framed as emergency. Calm ones become judgment. Victor wore charcoal wool, silver at the temples, and the expression of a man who had already decided the facts were probably uglier than whatever story he was about to hear. He looked at me first. That mattered. Not Dean. Not the receptionist. Not the secretary standing in borrowed confidence 2 feet from my husband's office. Me. Nora, he said. What happened? That was layer 2. No suspicion. No confusion. No, is there some misunderstanding? Just the assumption that my call had cause. Dean stepped in immediately. Victor. This is a private matter. Victor turned his head slightly. A private matter, he repeated. On the executive floor? Involving your receptionist, your secretary, your wife, and a missing marital disclosure? There it was. Missing marital disclosure. Camille's face emptied. She turned toward Dean slowly, like someone realizing the room she's been living in has no floor under it. Wife? She said. No one answered her. Victor didn't need to ask how I knew about the missing disclosure. He knew because he had drafted the ethics amendment himself after the last governance review. Senior officers at Carrington Biotech were required to disclose spousal relationships where material financial interests, board-linked families, or trust structures overlapped with executive decision-making. Mine overlapped with all 3, which meant there were only 2 possibilities. Dean had disclosed the marriage and deliberately allowed his staff to treat me like a stranger anyway. Or he had failed to disclose it at all. Neither was survivable. Not cleanly. Victor extended his hand toward Dean. Your badge? Dean stared at him. You're overstepping. No, Victor said. You just no longer understand the edge of your authority. That landed so cleanly the whole corridor seemed to sharpen around it. Victor looked at the wedding ring still resting on the portfolio. Then at me. Did she call him my man in front of you? He asked. I nodded once. Camille made a small sound. Half breath. Half panic. Victor's mouth flattened. That was the 3rd layer of truth. Not just that I was Dean's wife, that the structures around him, the legal ones, the ethical ones, the governance ones, the very ones he had relied on to look legitimate in rooms he had not built, were about to stop protecting him. And for the first time since I stepped off that elevator, I felt something colder than humiliation and stronger than anger. Accuracy. Dean had not merely betrayed me in private. He had erased me in public, in a place where my existence materially mattered, and let another woman claim that vacancy under his authority. Now the men who understood what that meant had arrived. And Dean, finally, knew it too. The panic started with Camille, not Dean. That's how I knew the whole structure was rottener than I'd even imagined. Dean still thought, for one long stupid minute, that this was fixable. Men like him always do. They believe enough tone, enough posture, enough selective calm can still reduce disaster to context. He was already angling toward that familiar executive voice measured. Disappointed, faintly burdened by the inconvenience of truth. He still thought this was a marital embarrassment with corporate edges. Camille understood faster, because unlike Dean, she wasn't protected by title. She had only proximity. And proximity is the first thing to catch fire when hierarchy shifts. Wait, she said, turning toward him fully now. You're married? No one answered her right away. That silence did something ugly to her face. The arrogance drained first. Then the flirtation. Then the hard little confidence she'd been wearing like perfume since I stepped off the elevator. What remained was much more ordinary. A woman realizing she had not been powerful, just useful. Dean tried to recover. Camille. No. She snapped. Too fast. Don't Camille me like I'm the one who did something. Interesting. Very interesting. She'd moved from possession to self-protection in under 20 seconds. Which told me two things. First, she was smarter than I'd given her credit for. Second, whatever Dean had let her believe, it had gone far enough that she now needed to decide whether to die beside him or drag him down first. Victor didn't interrupt. He never did when people were in the process of revealing themselves voluntarily. That's one of the reasons he terrified weaker men. He understood that panic is most useful when not rushed. Dean shifted his grip on the portfolio, still holding it. Absurdly. With my ring sitting on top like a tiny silver indictment, and finally tried for control. This is not the place, he said. We'll sort it out privately. There it was again. Privately. The last refuge of men who benefit from public disrespect and only remember intimacy when consequences appear. Victor turned to the receptionist. Freeze all executive floor visitor logs for this morning, he said. And notify compliance that I'm initiating an internal disclosure review. That landed hard. Because now the corridor wasn't just socially dangerous. It had become procedural. Traceable. Whatever Dean had been planning to explain away over lunch or behind a closed office door was already moving into systems. And systems don't care how charming you are when you tell the story later. Dean heard it too. That's unnecessary, he said. Victor looked at him like a man studying mold on expensive tile. No, he said. It's overdue. Camille took one step back from Dean's office door. That was the first visible crack. Not a dramatic flinch. Just one step. But in offices like that, distance is language. 10 minutes earlier, she had been leaning against the frame, thermos in hand, body angled like she belonged there. Now she was pulling herself out of the doorway like it had started burning. The compliance associate had reappeared by then, along with 2 more people from legal who were trying very hard to look as though they'd just happened to be walking by. No one believed that. Of course. Word had already started moving. You can feel it in executive spaces when scandal becomes structural. People don't gather. They orbit. Dean's face changed when he saw the extra witnesses. That was when the real panic entered him. Not because I had caught him. Not even because Victor had arrived. But because the audience had changed. We were no longer in the realm of hallway impropriety and office flirtation. We were in governance now. Disclosure. Ethics. Misrepresentation. The places where men like Dean discover that being clever in social rooms does not help much. What exactly? Victor asked. Did you tell this floor about your marriage? Dean said nothing. Wrong choice. Camille, unfortunately for him, had started thinking like a survivor. He didn't tell us anything, she said. Her voice was thinner now. But sharper, too. There was no wife. No mention of one. No disclosed conflict. No spouse on the holiday list. No family contact on the executive file I've handled. That one almost made the receptionist drop her pen. Dean turned on her. You should be very careful. No. Another mistake. Threatening the woman who had just realized she'd been professionally compromised on top of personally humiliated was the dumbest move available to him. And he took it instinctively. That meant fear had gotten all the way down into his bones. Camille stared at him for one heartbeat too long. Then she said the sentence that shifted the whole corridor. You let me look at her like she was nobody. There it was. Not the affair. Not even the flirtation. The deeper truth beneath all of it. He had not merely hidden me. He had curated my absence so thoroughly that another woman could claim my husband in public and feel safe doing it. Victor glanced at me then. Just once. And I knew he understood the scale correctly. This wasn't a private insult anymore. It was institutional erasure. The receptionist's phone rang. She answered. Listened. Then looked up with eyes wide enough to tell me exactly who was calling before she spoke. Mrs. Vale's office is on the line. Of course, Simone moved faster than people assumed because she never looked hurried. That was one of her gifts. She could make response feel like inevitability. Dean actually closed his eyes. Small moment. Devastating. Because now he knew the panic wasn't going to stay contained on this floor. It was moving upward. Into family. Into board memory. Into every room he had once entered, believing his narrative would arrive there first. Victor took the call from the receptionist and listened for maybe 15 seconds. Then he said, Understood. He handed the phone back. Turned to me. And said, Your mother is on her way. Dean's hand tightened on the portfolio hard enough to crease the leather. Camille looked at him. Then at me. Then at the ring, still sitting in plain view on top of the file. And for the first time since I'd arrived, nobody in that corridor seemed confused about who had authority here. The executive floor had gone dead quiet again. But this time it wasn't waiting for me to be diminished. It was waiting to see how far Dean Carrington was about to fall. The reveal happened 12 minutes later in the executive corridor. Under recessed lighting and the kind of silence that only exists in places where money and ego usually keep everyone too busy to listen. My mother did not rush. That was the first thing that made Dean look smaller. Simone Vale stepped off the elevator in a graphite suit. Pearls no larger than restraint required. And the expression of a woman who had already concluded she would not be the most embarrassed person in the room. She had that kind of beauty people mistake for softness until they realize it has survived boardrooms, funerals, and men who thought she would blink first. She didn't look at Dean. Not immediately. She looked at me. That mattered more than anything else. Not because I needed saving. Because the whole floor needed to understand who this moment belonged to. My mother crossed the polished tile, stopped beside me, and took in the wedding ring on the portfolio. Camille's white face. Victor Hale's stance. The receptionist, still frozen behind her desk. And Dean standing in front of his office like a man who had finally discovered that the room he curated so carefully could turn against him. Then she spoke. Nora, she said. Calm as winter glass. Are you all right? That was the reveal before the reveal. Because now the corridor had a frame. Not a scandal. Not an affair. Not some chaotic domestic scene that had wandered uninvited into the workplace. A mother asking her daughter if she was all right after visible humiliation. Every person standing there understood it. The receptionist lowered her eyes. The compliance associate straightened. Camille's hand tightened around the thermos so hard I thought she might dent it. Dean tried once more for tone. Simone, this has been misunderstood. My mother turned her head then. Just that. And whatever he intended to say next died where it stood. Has it? She asked. No raised voice. No sharpness. Nothing performative. But Dean's confidence thinned instantly. That was what people never understood about Simone Vale. She didn't need volume. She had lineage. Yes. But more than that. She had memory. She remembered who funded what. Who bridged whose debt during bad quarters. Who sat on which committee. Whose title rested on whose goodwill. Men like Dean could impress rooms. My mother could unmake them. Victor spoke next. Because he knew exactly when process should enter emotion and close the exits. Camille Hart publicly referred to Dean as my man in front of Nora. He said. Then denied Nora was his wife. Dean did not correct her. We also have a likely non-disclosure issue concerning the marriage and executive reporting structures. There it was. All at once. Not whispered. Not softened. Not translated into gentle euphemism for corporate digestion. Camille finally let go of the thermos. It hit the side credenza with a dull metallic sound and rolled once before settling against a tray of unopened mail. That tiny clatter seemed to wake the whole floor up. No one told me, she said. And her voice was wrong now thin. It's not Rav. All the lacquer stripped off. He never said there was no wife. No photos. No mansion. Nothing. Dean closed his eyes for half a second. Wrong move. Because silence. At that point, was admission. Simone looked at Camille then. And I watched the poor woman realize too late that she was no longer dealing with another executive wife who might choose dignity over consequence. My mother didn't waste cruelty. But she also never mistook ignorance for innocence when the ignorance had been weaponized. You were comfortable enough, Simone said, to claim my daughter's husband in public. Camille opened her mouth, closed it. There was no good answer. That was the beauty of truth in the right room. Eventually it becomes structurally impossible to be clever. Dean stepped forward then. Desperate enough to risk interruption. This is getting distorted. Camille made an inappropriate assumption. Yes. But that's hardly grounds for. Stop, I said. It was the first time I had raised my voice all morning. Not much. Just enough. But it landed harder because I had been so calm before. I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who had let another woman stand in his doorway and tell me, with her whole chest, that she would know if I were his wife. At the ringless hand still holding the portfolio. At the careful suit. The practiced concern. The executive language already reaching for the edges of a lie. And then I said the sentence that ended the ambiguity, for everyone. You didn't correct her because she wasn't confused. I said. She was repeating the reality you built here. That was the final reveal. Not that I was his wife. That he had erased me on purpose. The corridor held still around that. I saw it register first in the receptionist's face. Then the compliance associates. Then even in Camille, who looked suddenly less like a rival and more like a woman realizing she'd been given a script and told it was truth. Dean's mouth tightened. That's not fair. Fair. I almost laughed. Fair? I repeated. You removed our photo. You stopped wearing your ring. You let your floor treat me like a stranger. You let your secretary act like your office began and ended with her. And when she humiliated me in public, you asked what I was doing here. My mother didn't move. Victor didn't interrupt. No one did. Because everyone standing there knew the difference between a wife making a scene and a woman finally naming a system built to erase her. Dean tried one last time to reclaim the frame. I was protecting my private life. Simone's expression changed then. Just slightly. Enough to let the room see steel under polish. No. she said. You were privatizing your marriage so you could enjoy public ambiguity. That landed like a gavel. There was nowhere left for him to go after that. Not socially. Not legally. Not morally. Because the whole executive floor now understood exactly what had happened. Carrington Biotech's chief executive had concealed a materially relevant marriage, allowed a subordinate to claim him publicly, and built an environment in which the woman he married could be mistaken for disposable. He hadn't merely embarrassed me. He had exposed himself. And in front of the only witnesses who mattered. My husband's carefully managed world cracked open wide enough for everyone to see what was inside it. Dean's collapse started with paperwork. That felt right. Men like him spend years believing power lives in tone, posture, well-cut suits, and the ability to make everyone else in the room slightly unsure of their own standing. They think authority is social before it is structural. They mistake atmosphere for immunity. Then one day somebody says the words disclosure review, and the whole illusion starts shredding at the edges. Victor Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. After my mother named what Dean had done, privatized his marriage so he could enjoy public ambiguity, the corridor had already turned against him. All Victor had to do was give the reversal form. He took the portfolio from Dean's hand. Not aggressively. Not with a tug. Dean let go of it because for the first time since I'd arrived, he understood that resistance would only make him look exactly as compromised as he was. My wedding ring sat on top of the leather like a tiny sealed charge. Victor lifted it carefully and placed it into my palm. Then he opened the portfolio. Inside were the acquisition notes Dean had supposedly needed so urgently. Beneath them, clipped together in a separate section, were briefing documents for that afternoon's governance call, ethics disclosures, executive compensation review, a pending expansion vote, and the updated board conflict checklist. Victor turned one page, then another. Then, he looked up at Dean with the kind of disappointment that hits harder than rage because it strips a man of any fantasy that he is worth dramatic emotion. You signed the annual executive certification last month, he said. Dean said nothing. Wrong choice. Victor continued anyway. You affirmed there were no undisclosed spousal relationships materially relevant to board-linked financial structures, trust positions, or reporting line vulnerability. There it was. Not just a husband behaving badly. Not just a chief executive letting his secretary play act possession in the hallway. This was now an ethics breach. A governance problem. The kind of thing that travels very quickly once the right people hear the right nouns in the right order. Camille heard them too. And that was when she truly broke. Not emotionally. Strategically. She took 2 full steps away from Dean and set the thermos down on the credenza as if it had suddenly become evidence. Which, in a way, it had. That little domestic artifact, his coffee. Prepared by her. Carried by her. Displayed in front of me while she called him, my man had become the physical symbol of a fiction they had both been living inside. I was never told about any disclosure issue, she said. Too fast now. If there were rules? No one, Dean, never. Stop. Dean snapped. But it was too late for that. The moment Camille started protecting herself, the whole structure of his office life began spilling into the corridor in the ugliest possible way. Because everyone present could now see it wasn't one woman overreaching. It was a man who had built enough confusion around his marriage that the women around him could fight over a vacancy he created and still both think they were reacting to truth. The legal associate by the copy room stepped closer. So did compliance. The receptionist had stopped pretending this was a visitor issue and was now taking notes with a seriousness that told me she already understood something important. She was standing inside an incident report. Dean tried once more to recover ground. This has gotten wildly disproportionate, he said. I made a decision to separate my private life from the office. That may have created misunderstandings. But that doesn't justify this kind of public spectacle. Public spectacle. Interesting phrase from the man who had spent years benefiting from a silent one. My mother's eyes sharpened. No, she said. What created misunderstanding was your convenience. What created spectacle was your willingness to let another woman claim you in front of your wife and say nothing. That landed harder than anything before it. Because now the issue was no longer merely procedural. It was moral in a way no one in that corridor could responsibly unhear. Camille made the final mistake then. She looked at Dean, not at me. Not at Victor. Not at my mother, and said, almost accusingly, "You said there was no one at home who mattered." Silence. Perfect. Total silence. I don't think anyone breathed. Dean's face emptied. Not anger. Not yet. Something much worse. The expression of a man who realizes one line, spoken carelessly in private, has just detonated in public and redefined everything around him. My mother did not move. Victor did not blink. I looked at Camille and felt, for the briefest second, almost sorry for her. Because there it was at last, the real structure. She had not merely been arrogant. She had been fed a script. Not innocence. No. She had still chosen contempt. But her certainty had been built by a man who found it useful to make both women around him smaller in different ways. Dean opened his mouth. Closed it. Then Victor said the sentence that ended him. Dean Carrington. Effective immediately. You are to step away from all executive floor activities, pending formal board review. He said it like weather. Like something already true. Dean stared at him. You don't have authority to suspend me. Victor's expression didn't change. No. But I have authority to advise the board. Freeze, counsel, contact, privilege. And recommend immediate interim containment. Simone? My mother took out her phone. One text. That was all. Then she slipped it back into her bag. He has it now, she said. The he in question was the board chair. Dean knew it. So did everyone else? That was when his collapse became visible. Not shouting. Not pleading. He simply looked around the corridor and realized, all at once, that no one there still belonged to him. Not Camille, who had moved far enough away to count as self-preserving. Not the receptionist, who was already aligned with record. Not personality, not compliance or legal, who had started thinking in procedure. Not Victor. Not my mother. And certainly not me. He took one half step toward me, perhaps out of habit more than intention. Nora. No. I said. Just that. And because the room had fully turned. That one word carried more authority than his title did. Security arrived 2 minutes later. Quiet men in dark suits. Summoned not for violence, but for transition. The oldest humiliation in the corporate world is not being dragged out. It's being escorted with formality by people too professional to look impressed by your fall. They didn't touch Dean. They didn't have to. He walked. Past the receptionist. Past the copy room. Past the office door, where Camille had leaned like she owned something. Past me. He didn't look at anyone directly. That was the final indignity. Men like Dean, who live on reflected recognition, suffer most when they can no longer bear to meet the eyes of witnesses. Camille stayed behind, pale and rigid and suddenly very alone. Her collapse would come later. Dean's was happening now, and as the elevator doors closed on him, I understood something clean and almost peaceful. He had spent years making me disappear in that building. It had taken 15 minutes for the building to return the favor. The first thing I got back was my name. Not from Dean. He had forfeited any right to be the one who restored it. I got it back from the receptionist. After security took him downstairs, and the elevator doors closed behind the version of my husband he had built for that building. The executive floor stayed unnaturally still. Nobody moved for a few seconds. Not compliance. Not legal. Not Camille, who looked as if she had just been dropped inside a life she no longer recognized. Even the air conditioning seemed louder. Because silence after public humiliation always feels mechanical. As if the building itself is trying to reset. Then the receptionist stood. She came around the desk. Shoulders tight. Hands clasped too carefully. And looked directly at me. "I'm so sorry. Mrs. Carrington," she said. There it was. Not ma'am. Not Ms. Ellison. Not the vague politeness people use when they're still unsure where authority lives. Mrs. Carrington. Correctly. Publicly. In the same corridor where 10 minutes earlier I had been treated like a stranger who needed to be redirected. That mattered more than it should have. Because humiliation does not only wound by what it says. It wounds by rearranging a room around your supposed insignificance. And once the room begins correcting itself, once people start naming you accurately again, the damage starts to reverse in places deeper than pride. I nodded once. Thank you. Nothing grand. No speech. No magnanimous gesture. I didn't need to punish a young woman for believing the culture she had been trained to read. The correction itself was enough. Camille, on the other hand, was still standing in the blast zone of her own certainty. The thermos sat abandoned on the credenza. My ring was back on my hand. Victor had already passed the portfolio to one of the legal associates for review. My mother stood at my side like old architecture, beautiful, load-bearing, impossible to rush. Camille finally looked at me properly then. Not like a rival. Not like an obstacle. Not like a woman she had outranked socially inside Dean's carefully managed office fiction. She looked at me like someone seeing the actual room for the first time. "I didn't know," she said. That sentence had been circling all morning in different forms. But now it sounded different. Less like defense. More like the first honest thing she'd said since I arrived. My mother didn't answer. Victor didn't either. So I did. "No," I said. "You didn't." I let that sit for a second. Because he made sure of it. That landed on her face the way truth sometimes lands on people who have confused advantage for intimacy, slowly. Then all at once, I could almost watch the months rearranging themselves behind her eyes. The hidden ring. The missing photos. The careful absence of mention. The way Dean had allowed ambiguity to live where clarity should have been. The confidence he had rewarded in her when it served him. The ignorance he had cultivated because it made the office easier for him to inhabit as a free man during business hours. Her humiliation was not mine to carry. But I won't lie and say I felt nothing seeing it. I felt recognition, because that was the second thing I got back. Not pity from the room. Not revenge. Accuracy. What happened in that hallway was no longer two women fighting over a man. The story people like Dean always hope will survive after they've let women collide inside structures they built. It was a husband who had erased his wife in public and let a subordinate step into that vacancy. That distinction saved me. Victor turned to me then. "There are questions we need to ask formally," he said. "But they can wait until you decide whether you want to stay on this floor another minute." Another gift. Choice. I looked down the corridor toward Dean's office. The door was still half open. Through the glass I could see the desk. The credenza. The skyline, beyond the windows. Clean. Expensive. Controlled. The little kingdom where he had quietly removed every sign of me until his secretary could look me in the face and say she'd know if I were his wife. That room had been arranged around my absence. I did not want it. That realization was the third thing I got back. The ability to refuse spaces that only ever respected me once they were forced to. "No," I said. "I'm done here." My mother's expression changed almost imperceptibly approval. Yes. But more than that. Relief. She had watched enough women of her generation sacrifice their clarity to the performance of endurance. She had made some of those bargains herself once. With different men in different rooms. She knew what it cost. As we turned toward the elevator, Camille spoke again. "Nora. Just my name. No condescension. No smile." I stopped. But I didn't turn fully. She swallowed. "He told me there was no one at home who mattered. There are sentences that beg for revenge. That one didn't. It gave me something better. Confirmation. Not because I needed to hear that he had lied. I already knew that. But because now the lie had witnesses other than me. It existed outside the marriage. Outside my memory. Outside anything Dean could later explain away as emotional interpretation. I looked back at her. That, I said, was his mistake. Then I stepped into the elevator beside my mother and Victor Hale. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of the executive floor staff frozen in half-recovered posture. Legal, already moving. Compliance. Taking notes. Camille standing alone beside the thermos she no longer dared touch. And for the first time in a long while, I understood my place clearly. Not Dean's wife, as he preferred to define it. Not the decorative spouse who stayed home until useful. Not the absent figure in a carefully edited office life. I was Nora Ellison, Simone Vale's daughter. Victor Hale's client. The woman whose existence materially mattered in rooms Dean had been treating like private theater. He had tried to erase me there. Instead, he had given me back the one thing he could never actually control, my standing. 6 months later, nobody on Carrington Biotech's executive floor called Dean Carrington my man. Nobody called him much of anything at all. That was the new order. Not because he vanished overnight. Men like Dean rarely do. They linger in advisory limbo. In private negotiations. In carefully worded announcements where companies try to make institutional embarrassment sound like leadership transition. But the man who had stood in that corridor so certain he could privatize his marriage and enjoy public ambiguity did not survive the season intact. The board review didn't explode. It settled. That was worse. No dramatic scandal. No shouting on financial news. No tabloid frenzy. Just findings. Non-disclosure failures. Governance exposure. Material misrepresentation regarding related party optics. Procedural concerns around executive ethics certification. The sort of language that sounds bloodless until you understand what it does to a reputation built on controlled trust. Victor Hale saw to that. Not cruelly. Correctly. Dean resigned to focus on family and personal matters in a statement he did not write and hated every word of. He lost the acquisition vote he had been pushing. Lost the board's informal confidence. And lost the strange, soft social immunity that handsome executives sometimes enjoy long after they should have been audited by character alone. Once people understood he had not merely been unfaithful or arrogant but had deliberately erased his wife in a materially relevant setting, the room changed around him, permanently. That was the part he never recovered from. Not the title. Not the salary. The room. Camille left 3 weeks after he did. Not under dramatic accusation. Not because I demanded it. I didn't need to. She had already been stripped of the fiction that made her powerful. Once legal and compliance started reviewing access boundaries, communication patterns, and executive floor conduct, she became what she had always actually been, a junior employee who had built her confidence inside a lie she did not invent but enthusiastically inhabited. She asked to speak with me once before she left. We met in a conference room with glass walls and terrible coffee. She looked younger without the heels. Without the polished tilt of her chin. Without Dean's corridor to animate her posture. I really didn't know, she said. I believed her. Not because she was innocent. She wasn't. But there is a difference between malice and misrepresentation. She had still chosen contempt. She had still looked me in the eye and denied my place. But by then I understood something that made anger less useful than clarity. Women like Camille are often handed a script by men like Dean and told it is reality. I know, I said. She looked relieved too quickly, which annoyed me enough to finish the thought. That doesn't excuse what you did with what you thought you knew. That landed. She nodded. Eyes down. No defense this time? Good. We did not become allies. This is not that kind of story. Some humiliations do not need redemption arcs attached to every participant. Sometimes, the most merciful ending is simply accuracy delivered in the right tone. As for me, the strangest thing was how little I wanted from the building once it stopped lying. I did not want Dean's office. I did not want a seat on the board. I did not want some compensatory title at Carrington Biotech to prove I still mattered. That was his logic, not mine. He believed worth had to be staged in the room where it was denied. I no longer did. What I wanted was smaller and, because it was smaller, more final. I wanted the truth entered correctly. My marriage status was formally disclosed where it should have been months earlier. The executive ethics review was amended. The receptionist learned my name before I ever had to say it again. The old photo of Dean and me that had vanished from his office was never put back. Which was right. Some props do not deserve resurrection once the performance ends. And I took my own name back cleanly. That part mattered most. I stopped using Carrington in rooms where it had only ever functioned as camouflage for his convenience. I went back to Nora Ellison on everything that belonged to me. Legal documents, foundation work, family offices, correspondence. Not because I was erasing history, because I was done lending my identity to structures that had only respected it when dragged into light. My mother and I grew quieter after that. But closer in the useful way, not sentimental. Not tearful. Just more exact with each other. One Sunday evening, maybe 2 months after Dean's resignation, we were having dinner in her townhouse when she set down her wine and said, "I should have asked sooner what he was becoming at work." I looked up. That was not a common sentence from Simone Weil. My mother rarely apologized in the soft language people use to soothe themselves. When she regretted something, she named the lapse precisely. "You trusted him." I said, "No," she replied. "I trusted your discretion to always cost you less than it actually did." That stayed with me. Because she was right. For too long, I had mistaken dignity for silence. I had believed that refusing to make scenes was the same thing as maintaining standards. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is simply a slower form of disappearance. The new order did not require me to become loud. Only visible where it counted. Now I sit on 2 boards my father once chaired. Victor still calls me before major trust shifts. My mother still dresses like judgment and patience had a daughter. And when I walk into rooms that once would have introduced me only by relation, people use my name first. Not Dean's wife. Not attached. Not adjacent. Mine. Sometimes I still think about that corridor. The thermos on the credenza. Camille's hand on the office door. The way she said "my man" with that easy little proprietary laugh. As if my absence were an established fact and not a wound Dean had curated. What she didn't know then was that she was doing me one brutal favor. She said the quiet part out loud. She turned years of subtle erasure into one public sentence I could no longer pretend not to understand. And because she did, the whole arrangement died in daylight. That is how the story really ends. Not with revenge. With correction. He let another woman claim him in front of me because he thought I had no standing left there. Now he has no standing left there at all. And I no longer have to wonder who I am in any room he once controlled.